Hello folks, in this guide we are taking a look into some of Khazan's terminology and making sense of some of the more cryptic or even non-existent descriptions. The big question I see floating around a lot is regarding Damage Multiplier and what it exactly means. There doesn't seem to be much light shed on this right now, and most people are unaware of its importance, so I've put together a solid description as well as explaining a handful of other terminologies, so look no further and let's get started. To start with the big one, and what most folks will have come for, is the Damage Multiplier attribute. Put simply, Damage Multiplier is the final attribute taken into consideration when dealing damage. As a very basic example of this, say for instance we have 100 damage as our baseline and we receive a buff of a 10% damage increase. This would effectively then take us to 110 raw damage. If we were to then gain a Damage Multiplier buff of 10%, this would take the 100 damage and the 10% increase into consideration, granting us 11 additional damage, 10 damage for the 100 base, and 1 additional damage for the extra 10 damage granted by the 10% buff. This makes Damage Multiplier a very valuable attribute, but it will only ever be as strong as your raw damage numbers are, meaning you would want to focus on increasing your damage and Damage Multiplier simultaneously. To go much deeper, Damage Multiplier takes into consideration any and all raw damage numbers and modifiers you may have. As another example, say we have 100 damage as our baseline and we have a frontal assault damage increase of 10%. As a quick side note, frontal assault is a condition in which the damage buff will only be applied when attacking the enemy from the front. Well, in this case, Damage Multiplier would then take this into consideration, and then we would again have 121 damage overall. If we then factor in the 10% buff mentioned in the previous example, we would then have 100 base damage, 10% inherent increase, 10% more if attacking from the front, and then the Damage Multiplier would take this 120 and add an additional 10%, which would be 12, making the final number 132. You can see that Damage Multiplier was able to add an additional 12 damage over either of the 10 damage buffs. However, Damage Multiplier is only able to do this due to the multiple raw damage buffs active. As a final example, say for instance we have 100 damage gain as our baseline and we had a damage buff increase of 100%, making it 200 damage overall. Then a 10% damage multiplier increase would then take us to 220. Obviously, this makes 100% damage increase much more valuable than 10% damage multiplier, but it helps to show the effects Damage Multiplier has and why it's worth keeping an eye on it and trying to increase it as you progress further through the game. That's about it for the Damage Multiplier attribute. As you can imagine, its intricacies can go quite deep once you start stacking multiple buffs on top of one another, and crunching the numbers is not something we're covering here, but I do hope that has helped to explain what Damage Multiplier actually is. Up next, we have a handful of other terminologies, not necessarily described very well or at all. As a brief side note, there is an in-game encyclopedia that does have a lot of this information available, but otherwise, we'll be running through the most important. First, we have critical, which is directly in regards to our own health, and it only takes effect when at 30% health or less. Enemy critical takes effect when the enemy's health is at or below 50% health. Unscathed takes effect when at completely full health, and enemy unscathed takes effect when the enemy is also at full health. Confront takes effect when engaged in combat with one single enemy, and surrounded takes effect when engaged in combat with 3 or more enemies. Frontal assault takes effect when attacking an enemy from the front, and frontal damage takes effect when being attacked from the front. Rear assault and rear damage work the exact same way, except for when attacking or being attacked from behind instead. Depleted takes effect when our stamina reaches 0, and exhausted takes effect when being damaged whilst currently depleted. Finally, Enraged takes effect when at 50% stamina or less, and Composed takes effect when at 50% stamina or more. As you can see, these attributes can really change how we approach combat. A solid example would be greatsword users aiming to acquire plenty of frontal assault buffs, as staying in front of the enemy and laying out big damage is what they do best, as opposed to a spear main maybe wanting rear assault instead, due to constantly being able to weave behind the enemy and take advantage of the back a lot more. There's tons of options. Damage Multiplier does affect them all for the most part, and understanding what's best for your own playstyle will help go a long way in tightening up your build and ploughing through the game. That's it for this guide, folks. I do have a range of guides on the channel currently, and I am working hard on many more, so do feel free to stop on by and check things out. I should have a Steam key giveaway to announce for Khazan very, very soon, so do keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, thanks for watching, folks, and until next time, peace.